Today, I want to begin by posing a few philosophical questions. What does life mean? When does human life begin? And when do human rights begin? Now, the answers to these questions are inherently subjective. They're value judgments. But hopefully, science can help to inform uh, our responses to these questions. For example, what does life mean? Well, if you asked a biologist might say that um, any unicellular organism is life, qualifies as life. So it's so tiny that you can't see it with your bare eyes. You got to look through a microscope to see it, but and it has no system or structure outside of the individual cell itself. But nonetheless, it it performs the function of metabolism, homeostasis, and reproduction, and therefore it is a living cell and qualifies as life. Now, if we were to find a unicellular organism of that type on another planet, let's say Mars, then we would say that there's life on Mars. It's not little green men running around. It's not intelligent life. It's not even developed life. It's just life at the most basic level, the beginning structure of life. And with the level of cellular development could matter in terms of context and how we respond to this question. In some cases, maybe that wouldn't qualify as the type of life we're talking about. Maybe there's unintelligent life that forms millions of cells work together in a system, and but an unintelligent system. And so, for example, coral reef or plants might fall into this category. There's also sort of higher level cellular organisms, structures, such as insects, and even higher level like mammals. So, what we're talking about, what qualifies as life, could vary in different contexts. Most of us, even people who take the sort of the extreme view that human life begins at conception, which is a unicellular sort of organism, wouldn't think twice about destroying a unicellular organism on the sidewalk. It wouldn't even see it. You've got to have a microscope to see it. Or even a more fully developed structure, unintelligent structure. So, for example, a plant, for example, but might take a very different perspective on a blastocyst, for example, which is a pre-pregnancy human blob of cells, not blob of cells that occurs in a human. It's not. I didn't mean to imply that the blob of cells is human. The so some people also take a different perspective on beginning of life versus end of life. For some people, the blastocyst or the embryo or whatever is worthy of human life or human rights, even if it's not yet human life. But at the end of life, somebody who's brain dead but is otherwise has a fully developed structural system as a human, it would be okay to take them off life support and let them die. And so some people have these sort of conflicting viewpoints and don't even realize that they do, but oftentimes rooted in ignorance and a lack of understanding and so on. But we're not here to talk about all that. The main point here being that people formulate opinions, make subjective statements, value judgments, oftentimes based on things other than a sort of sober reading of the information available to them. Sometimes, they're informed by religion, they're informed by persuasive politicians with whom they typically listen, to whom they typically listen, their friends, their family, things like that, without really thinking through all the contradictions and so on. Yeah. So, anyways, with that said, I want to talk about natural abortion, and we'll move into induced abortion after that. But natural abortion, what are we talking about? First, let's sort of go through the steps. Conception, some people don't realize this. Conception actually doesn't occur when you have intercourse. It takes a while for the sperm to find the egg. And usually that's 24 to 72 hours after intercourse. Theoretically, it could happen within a few hours. It sometimes happens as far as a week later. But generally, 24 to 72 hours after conception, the sperm finds the egg, fertilizes the egg. You have conception. You have essentially a unicellular organism at that point. And backing up a little bit, the sperm or the egg prior to that fertilization, those are some people, some religions, for example, would say that those are living organisms as well, and should be afforded human dignity and that sort of thing. So, for example, I think there's a sentence in the Bible or something about not spilling a man's seed or wasting his sperm, essentially. Well, if you don't use the sperm, if it's not ejaculated or otherwise extracted from the testicles within a few weeks, it's going to be naturally destroyed by the body and reabsorbed into the body anyways. And so that, if you want to call it a human seed, that's being destroyed naturally every 2 weeks if it's not used. On the female side, an egg is discarded from the body every month if it's not used, if it's not fertilized. So, anyways, sort of skipping that level of perspective, that sort of thing, that form of cellular existence should be preserved and given human rights, or however you want to think of that. Starting with conception, many people say that once conception occurs, there should be, that's a human, that should be given human rights, that sort of thing. But there are some irregularities about that perspective that you'll see as we talk here. So anyways, after conception occurs, a zygote is formed, which is essentially a fertilized egg. That quickly transitions into what's called a blastocyst, which is an early stage embryo. Together, the zygote and the blastocyst takes about a week. And so we can call this week 1. And, if you take 24 to 72 hours post intercourse for conception to occur, and then a week for this to occur, we're talking about, let's say 10 days here. Could be 7 days, could be 2 weeks, but let's call it 10 days from intercourse to the blastocyst occurring. And it's not until the blastocyst implants in the uterus that a pregnancy occurs. So again, 7 to 10 days, 7 to 14 days, let's call it 10 days after intercourse before pregnancy even occurs. During that period, skipping all of the sperm and eggs that are wasted, even during intercourse, not used, don't result in conception. Just looking at the unicellular organism after conception to pregnancy, 30 to 70% of those conceptions will not make it to pregnancy. Those women will have zero knowledge that they had even conceived. Sexually active women who don't use protection have probably conceived. Many of them, most of them, especially as you get older, you have more life experiences and so on, have conceived without ever knowing or without ever getting pregnant and without ever knowing it. That's kind of a wide range, that 30 to 70%. It's kind of difficult to study these things, but this is the best estimate of science available today. So wide range, but the important thing here is to understand that, let's say half, let's take the middle of that range, half of all conceptions do not even become pregnancies. Once, oops, what happened there? I went backwards there. Once pregnancy occurs, once the blastocyst implants in the uterus, then it becomes an embryo for weeks 2 to 8. Now, this is another point where there's some, certainly some inconsistencies in people's views. Some people believe that you can freeze individual sperm and eggs, cryopreserve. It's called cryopreservation. Freeze them so that they can be unfrozen later and used. Others, depending on the context, we're going to talk about fertility treatments and so on, infertility treatments soon. But you can also have conception first. So the sperm fertilizes the egg and then cryopreserve it, and that's called colloquially a frozen embryo. And so there you have a conception, post-conception, it's frozen. Some people take the view that those embryos should be treated with the dignity of human life. Others, in most cases, they're not used, they're discarded. There's different, wildly different perspectives on that as well. So anyways, embryo weeks 2 to 8, and a fetus, it's called a fetus after week 9 until a live birth. A miscarriage is a pregnancy that spontaneously or unintentionally ends before week 20. There are about 10 to 20% of known pregnancies end in miscarriage, but about 26% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. So the difference in those percentages are that some pregnancies end in miscarriage before it's ever known that there was a pregnancy. So the blastocyst implants, but then there's a miscarriage prior to a woman knowing that she's pregnant. And so that accounts for the difference there. So 26% of all pregnancies end in miscarriage. After 20 weeks, basically once you've reached 20 weeks, most that make it that far can survive. They become viable, meaning that if the fetus had to be removed prematurely, or the woman were to give birth prematurely to a fetus after 20 weeks, then it's possible that it could survive on its own. Prior to that, absent cryopreservation in the embryonic stage, not so much. So anyways, 0.6%, that's 6 out of 1,000 births are stillbirths. And so, it's rare, but it's not extremely rare. I know women who have had stillbirths. Some of you probably do too, as well. So a stillbirth is any spontaneous birth of the fetus from week 20 forward, prior to or until live birth. And after live birth, then we refer to it as a baby. Now the math shows if we figure out all these numbers, ignoring how much sperm and eggs are discarded from the body naturally, or not used in the process of conception, even when used in intercourse on the sperm side, I'm referring here. Just looking at conceptions that occur, the math shows that somewhere between 48 and 78% of conceptions fail to result in a live birth due to natural causes. Now, if you add to that, 15 to 20% of pregnancies are terminated by induced abortion, then 59 to 84% of conceptions do not result in a live birth. The difference here, the induced abortion, that means that basically it's an intentional abortion. That's basically what people are talking about when they talk about abortion in politics or a legal sense, or talk about getting an abortion or making abortion illegal. Well, when you make abortion illegal, what you're really doing is making induced abortion illegal. These natural abortions are still going to occur. They occur, 2 to 5 times more frequently than induced abortions. And actually, in the United States, we have the worst outcomes for women and children in terms of reproductive outcomes, pregnancy outcomes, birthing outcomes. We have the worst numbers in the industrialized world, in the Western world. So we are, there's a lot of political effort, a lot of emotional effort put into preventing induced abortions. There's not very much put into reducing the incidence of natural abortions. It's a little bit of a disconnect, a little bit of ignorance, a little bit of religious and political people who have soapboxes to stand on, and people who listen to them saying what should be important and what shouldn't. In reality, if people really cared about reducing the incidence of potential human life being lost prior to birth, then they would focus more on the natural abortions that occur and reducing the incidence of those, because they occur in far higher numbers than induced abortion. All right, so an audience response question. Induced abortion should be legal, but only in certain circumstances, or illegal? What do you think? In a last time I did this in class, 48% of class said that it should be legal in all circumstances. 33% legal in certain circumstances, and 20% said it should be illegal essentially in all circumstances. Compared to a national poll, basically these numbers have been very consistent for decades. In the United States, about 25% of people think that induced abortion should be legal in all circumstances. 53% sometimes, so in some circumstances yes, in other circumstances no, and 21% illegal in all circumstances. As those national poll numbers suggest, there are some Americans at one end of the continuum where they believe abortion should be accessible to women at any time, under any circumstance. There are others who believe that abortion should not be available under any circumstance at any time. However, the majority, I think it was 53%, believe that it should be available to women some of the time in some circumstances. So oftentimes you'll hear abortion as a polarized issue with Americans. It's generally perceived that way because the loudest voices on the issue are at the ends of the continuum, the opposing ends of the continuum. But again, a majority of Americans are somewhere in between the two and have more nuanced views on abortion. So most Americans believe that abortion should be accessible in at least, if not all circumstances and times, at least some circumstances and or times. Oftentimes, for those with more nuanced perspectives, the breakdown between should be available, should not be, is in the rationale for divorce, induced abortion. They might say, for example, that if it's due to life circumstances, such as I don't have money for another kid, my partner left me, that those aren't sufficient rationales for abortion. But if the pregnancy occurred due to rape, incest, or the woman's health, physical or mental health, are at risk, then those are sufficient reasons for abortion. Others in that 53% will base it on timing in the pregnancy. So, for example, we often talk about pregnancy in trimesters: first trimester, second trimester, third trimester. And they might say, for example, that abortions should be accessible to everybody under any circumstance for any reason for example, the first and second trimester, but not in the third, which is often colloquially referred to as late-term abortion. For many, they might say, third trimester is okay if it's due to the mother's health. Others might say it's okay due to mother's health or abnormal development of the fetus, some issue that arose. Others, might say that it's okay in, first or second trimester for any reason, but just not third trimester. So there's lots of different nuances and ways that this breaks down. But most Americans have some sort of nuance in terms of when and where abortion should be accessible. Important point here: nobody is pro-abortion and nobody is anti-life. The pro-life sort of terminology that's used on that group sort of suggests that others are anti-life. The pro-choice doesn't mean pro-abortion. And people will sometimes get that confused and sometimes use that disparagingly, those not make those distinctions intentionally. But the key is everybody wants to reduce the incidence of induced abortion. The real debate is over how, and those on the what we call the pro-choice camp have one approach to reducing the incidence of abortion. Those in the pro-life camp have a different approach to reducing the incidence of induced abortion. And so that's what we'll talk about next. Now, the two perspectives, I'll refer to them as the public health approach and the ideological approach. In the public health approach, evidence-based information is used to reduce the incidence of unwanted pregnancy, which inevitably leads to induced abortion. Whereas the ideological approach, the idea is essentially those who take this approach do what feels good, do what feels right, without evidence-based knowledge to support their approach. And so I'll give you some examples here. Those who take the ideological approach prefer that we don't educate about or provide access to contraception because of often because of fear that doing so would encourage or at least convey condonement to non-marital sex. The idea that those who aren't married, who are having sex, get pregnant, have abortion. It's actually a disconnect from the data. A huge number of those who obtain abortions are actually married. Similarly, they want to eliminate teenage or premarital sex. Again, it's a disconnect. The idea being that teenagers who get pregnant often seek abortion. Unmarried people who get pregnant often seek abortion. However, it ignores the fact that a huge number of people, even a majority of people who have abortions, are not teenagers and are not unmarried. And so sort of ignoring some of that data. They also want to make abortion illegal. This is what I call the out of sight, out of mind approach. We know from history and from context, cultural context, and our own history and other countries and so on, that when abortion is illegal, people still have abortions. They just do so in other ways. Those who have resources will go to where it is legal to obtain an abortion. Those who do not have resources, some of them will be forced to have an unwanted pregnancy and give birth, and some of them will put it up for adoption, and others will be born into circumstances that are not ideal for child development, and then it leads to other problems. But also many of those who don't have the resources to obtain an abortion elsewhere will obtain an illegal abortion, essentially. And those are often done in circumstances that can put their own health and life at risk. And so it's not, making abortion illegal does not prevent abortion. And in fact, it creates some additional problems. So that's the ideological approach, some common sort of themes to it. From the public health perspective, using that approach, these people want comprehensive sex education taught in, for example, high schools, so that people understand how to protect themselves, from unwanted pregnancy. There's evidence that shows that those who have a complete understanding, a better understanding about contraceptives, how they work, and so on, are more likely to use them and more likely to use them effectively to prevent unwanted pregnancy than those who don't. And the other idea here is that you've got to not only educate people, inform people so that they can make intelligent, informed decisions about contraception, but you've also got to make it available and affordable. And sometimes that's sometimes people know and want contraception because they don't, to avoid an unwanted pregnancy, but they have difficulty obtaining it, whether because can't be obtained over the counter, and so you have to see a physician and you don't have access to a physician, or your health insurance doesn't cover it, or your health insurance doesn't cover the cost of contraception, or Emergency contraception too. I've got that note here. It's different than the abortion pill. Some have the misperception that emergency contraception is an abortion pill. Those are two separate things, two different things. The abortion pill will terminate a pregnancy. Emergency contraception will not. Emergency contraception works during that period after intercourse, but before conception. Remember, we talked about that earlier. You got, in the worst case, a couple of hours, but generally 24 to 72 hours, sometimes up to a week after intercourse, before conception occurs. If you take emergency contraception before conception occurs, then it can prevent conception from occurring. If conception has already occurred before you take it, then it does nothing. And so, it's not an abortion pill. It's simply contraception, that is prevention of conception, that's taken after intercourse rather than before. Interestingly, 8% of women who are at risk of pregnancy who have never used contraception account for 46% of induced abortions. So if you find a way to reach that population with education, information, access, affordability to contraceptions, then you can substantially reduce the incidence, the demand for induced abortion. 83% who obtain abortions weren't using contraception when the unintended pregnancy occurred. Who weren't using contraception when the unintended pregnancy occurred had used contraceptives previously. So why did they stop? Was it too expensive? Were they having side effects, unwanted side effects? Were they not able to access a physician to renew their subscription? Why did they take contraceptives and then stop? That's a point of intervention that could prevent these people from unwanted pregnancy in the future. And then 51% of those who obtain abortion report using contraception that failed, in large part due to inappropriate or inconsistent use. So a majority of people who obtain abortion were using contraception at the time that the unwanted pregnancy occurred. However, they were not using it correctly, or they weren't using consistently. Again, those are points of intervention that that could be places where the incidence of unwanted pregnancy could be reduced, thereby reducing the incidence of unwanted or induced abortion. So again, the public health approach looks at evidence, finds places for intervention that can proactively reduce the incidence of unwanted pregnancy, thereby eliminating or substantially reducing the incidence of induced abortion. The ideological approach, on the other hand, as a scientist, I have to say that approach is nonsensical. It lacks logic. It's illogical, in the sense that it's not practical. And those who pursue that approach are missing opportunities to meaningfully reduce the incidence of abortion by not looking at the data and following the data and the points of intervention that could occur realistically, practically, that are actually feasible. And what about the safety of obtaining an abortion for the woman? There's a lot of talk about this among those who want to make abortion illegal, or at least to regulate it to the point that it's impractical, unobtainable. in reality, having a legal abortion is safer for women than going through childbirth. 0.5%, or 1 out of 200 women who have an induced abortion experience some sort of complications from mild to more serious after having an abortion. That risk is much greater for those who have a late term abortion or a second trimester, third trimester abortion. However, the vast majority of women have abortions prior to, in the first trimester. I think about 2/3 have it in the first trimester, and all but like 0.5% or something have it in the first or second trimester. And as we discussed earlier, those who have it later, it's due to unexpected complications that arise due to the development of the fetus or the woman's health, and results in an induced abortion later in pregnancy that the woman actually wanted to carry to term and have a child. So that's sort of a different context. But in any case, abortion-related death, if we just speak about death, which is obviously the most serious complication that can arise, but for women, it's 1 in a million if they have an abortion during the first 9 weeks. 1 in 29,000 in weeks 16 to 20, and 1 in 11,000 in weeks 21 plus. So you can see how the risk increases exponentially as you wait longer in pregnancy. And part of that is because the reason for having a later pregnancy abortion is often because there are already risks present. But this also, when those who oppose abortion, they often try to implement regulations that result in a delay in obtaining abortion, with the idea being that if you delay, then eventually they'll give up, or they'll change their mind or something. Where in reality, by delaying, you're actually creating sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of increasing the risks that are present to the woman in abortion. In contrast, 6 to 8% of pregnancies are high risk, and they're 10 times, a woman is 10 times more likely to die from childbirth than from having a legal abortion. So again, a lot of talk about abortion safety for the women, and concerns about that. In fact, if we were really concerned about women's health and safety, then the advisable path would be to have an abortion, because you're at greater risk by giving birth. Now, when does abortion occur? As you can see in this graph, it tends to occur quite early in pregnancy, as I've already stated. I actually underestimated the percentage of first trimester abortions on the previous slide. I was actually thinking of prior to week 9, but actually first trimester goes through week 12. And so you can see here more than 88% of induced abortions occur in the first 12 weeks or the first trimester. There is no evidence of future fertility problems if done using a safe standard procedure during the first 12 weeks. There have been instances where a later abortion or an illegal abortion done in contexts where you have to do it in an unsafe manner or using an unstandard procedure can negatively impact a person's future fertility and ability to go through pregnancy. where that might be a concern. Some people are having abortion because they don't want any more children. Some are doing it because they don't want children yet, or other reasons, that are beyond their control. Rape, incest, health of the mother, whatever the case may be. But in any case, there shouldn't be any real concern about being able to go through a pregnancy later after having an abortion, provided that abortion is done in a safe, standard way early in the pregnancy and so on. Another thing, if you look at the chart, you can see after starting at weeks 21, past week 21, we're really talking about tenths of a percent of people who have an abortion at that point. And again, those are cases where, it was really an unwanted abortion, but necessitated due to some unexpected complications that arose. Now, if you're looking at the incidence of abortions, induced abortions since Roe versus Wade in 1973, which basically legalized abortion throughout the United States. It was revisited last year, but since then, in the years while Roe versus Wade was the law of the land, as they say, you can see that the rate of abortions initially jumped quite a lot as people had more access to it. They certainly took advantage of it. And then, but you can see from, once the rate, essentially once the rate reached the point where it would have been if it had been legal. When Roe versus Wade was decided, abortion was legal and accessible in many states, but not in all states. And so essentially this rise that you see isn't suddenly people saying, oh, I have access to abortion. I don't need to use contraception anymore, or I can have premarital sex now, or something like that. It was basically people who previously didn't have access to abortion now having access to abortion. And so once that rate hit, then or reached its capacity based on everybody having legal access to abortion, since then, for the next 4 or 5 decades, the rate has consistently decreased. That's generally attributed to the access and affordability and effectiveness of contraceptives, birth control pill, lots of new types of contraception that, the patch and the shot and all kinds of things that you don't have to remember every day. And so essentially there's not that misuse or the unintentional forgetting of the contraceptive resulting in unwanted pregnancy, or not as much anyways, with those methods. So essentially knowledge about and access to affordable and effective contraception is what this decline in the incidence of abortion portrays over the last multiple decades. And again, that speaks to the public health approach, essentially reducing the incidence of abortion by providing better and more effective education and access to contraceptions that people can use in their everyday life and use effectively. And finally, our final slide for this lecture, I want to convey the demographics of who obtains an abortion. I've mentioned a few times in previous slides some myths or stereotypes about who obtains an abortion. In reality, people of across all demographic dimensions and categories obtain an abortion. So let's look at some numbers. 61% are in their 20s, 12% are teenagers. So those numbers are pretty high, but nonetheless, that's 73%. So that leaves 27% who obtain an abortion are in their 30s or 40s. 51%, I mentioned this earlier on a previous slide, 51% were using a contraceptive method at the time of the unintended or unwanted pregnancy. 24% of them were using condoms, so you might imagine that the condom broke or something of that sort. 13% were using birth control pills, so there's probably a forgot a pill, missed a pill, something of that sort that occurred there. In terms of racial ethnic classification, a majority of those who obtain an abortion are white. However, blacks and Hispanics are overrepresented relative to their representation in the overall population. That can largely be attributed to, again, socioeconomic status, education, access to healthcare, to contraception, knowledge about contraception, those sorts of things. 62% reported a religious affiliation, 17% mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, 13%, 24% Catholic. So these numbers are maybe higher than you would expect, given that pretty much all religions do not look favorably upon induced abortion. And yet a majority, almost 2/3 of those who have an abortion identify with a religion. 75% were poor or low income. Again, this tracks with, it's highly correlated with socioeconomic status, education, race, ethnicity, these sorts of things. And so this isn't really surprising at all. But it does suggest that a vulnerability when, for example, abortion is made illegal in some places but not others. Again, it speaks to those with resources, with the ability to go to another state, for example, to obtain an abortion, will still be able to do so. But the poor and low income people who would like to have an abortion will not have access to it due to not only a lack of money to travel, but also a lack of resources, lack of mode of transportation, a lack of flexibility in their work schedule, those sorts of things. 67% had never been married, and so nonetheless, 33%, a third of those who obtain an abortion had been married, and 59% already had a child, one or more children, and so only 41% of those who obtained an abortion didn't already have children. And so these aren't necessarily people trying to avoid parenthood. They are already parents, and for various reasons, whatever reason, did not want to have another child. So that wraps up what I will speak to on abortion, induced abortion, and natural abortion and induced abortion. And I'm going to put up a film related to this, and so you can jump over and watch that now if you want to get the whole topic all at once, or you can watch it a bit later, as you wish. All right, see you next time.